The CNN studio lights burned bright as Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old Harvard law professor emeritus, leaned forward in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Congresswoman Crockett might want to review her law school notes," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Her understanding of constitutional law is elementary at best." The camera cut to Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old Texas congresswoman, her expression calm, but her eyes blazing with quiet determination. The first-term representative didn't flinch as the legendary attorney continued his verbal assault. What happened next left the entire panel speechless. Within minutes, Dershowitz would be fumbling for words, his face flushed red with embarrassment, as Crockett systematically dismantled not just his argument, but his entire legal reputation on live national television. This wasn't just another political debate. This was the moment Jasmine Crockett showed America exactly why you don't underestimate a black woman from the South with a law degree and years in the courtroom. Before we continue with this shocking confrontation, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about powerful political showdowns that change the game. Now, let's dive into how this extraordinary face-off unfolded. The evening had started as a standard CNN panel discussion on presidential powers and congressional oversight. The moderator, Anderson Cooper, sat at the center of the sleek glass table, his silver hair gleaming under the studio lights. To his right sat Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard law professor emeritus who had built his reputation defending high-profile clients and authoring numerous books on constitutional law. At 85, Dershowitz carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in the legal spotlight. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th congressional district. At 43, she was relatively new to Congress, but not to legal battles. Before her political career, Crockett had worked as a criminal defense attorney and civil rights lawyer, fighting in courtrooms across Texas. Her deep blue blazer contrasted with her gold statement necklace, professional yet bold, much like her approach to politics. Also joining the panel were a senior political correspondent and a former Justice Department official, both of whom had been largely overshadowed by the escalating tension between Dershowitz and Crockett. The discussion had started civilly enough, focusing on a recent Supreme Court decision regarding executive privilege. Dershowitz, speaking with the slow, measured cadence he was known for, had defended an expansive view of presidential powers. The Constitution, he explained, leaning forward for emphasis, clearly grants the executive branch significant latitude in these matters. This has been my position consistently across administrations. Crockett had listened attentively, nodding occasionally, her expression revealing nothing. When Cooper turned to her for a response, she began outlining her different interpretation of the same constitutional principles. Her voice was clear and precise as she cited specific precedents that contradicted Dershowitz's position. It was then that the tone shifted. Dershowitz's face tightened, his eyebrows furrowing as Crockett spoke. He began to interrupt her, his hand raised, voice growing louder. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, I've been teaching constitutional law since before you were born. This isn't a matter for debate among serious scholars." Cooper attempted to intervene. "Professor, let's allow the Congresswoman to finish her point." "But," Dershowitz continued, his tone becoming increasingly dismissive. "Anderson, there's a fundamental misunderstanding here that needs correction. The Congresswoman is conflating separate legal principles in a way that no first-year law student would." The camera cut to Crockett, who maintained her composure, though a sly tightening around her eyes betrayed her growing irritation. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the brewing confrontation. Dershowitz wasn't finished. With a patronizing smile, he turned directly to Crockett. "Congresswoman, perhaps this is why we have such dysfunction in Congress. Basic legal principles are misunderstood by those elected to make our laws." He chuckled, looking toward the camera as if sharing an inside joke with the viewers at home. "She might want to audit my class at Harvard. I'd be happy to provide her with some remedial constitutional education." The studio fell silent. Cooper, visibly uncomfortable, turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, would you like to respond?" Crockett straightened in her chair, her gaze steady and unflinching as she looked directly at Dershowitz. The tension in the studio was palpable as she prepared to speak. Viewers across America leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. "Thank you, Anderson," Congresswoman Crockett began, her voice calm but firm. "Professor Dershowitz, I've sat here patiently listening to you speak down to me, as if I walked into this studio off the street, rather than out of a courtroom where I've spent years practicing the very law you claim I don't understand." Dershowitz's eyebrows rose, but before he could interject, Crockett continued, her pace measured and deliberate. "You've suggested I need remedial education, so let me be clear about my credentials. I graduated with honors from the University of Houston Law Center. I've argued before the highest courts in Texas. I've defended hundreds of clients when their constitutional rights were on the line, not just written about these rights from the comfort of a Harvard office." Cooper tried to regain control of the segment. "Let's try to focus on the issue at hand." "I'm addressing the issue at hand, Anderson," Crockett responded, without breaking eye contact with Dershowitz. "The professor has questioned my understanding of the Constitution, so it's important that viewers know exactly who they're listening to in this discussion." The camera caught Dershowitz shifting in his seat, his expression hardening. "Credentials aren't arguments, Congresswoman. The legal principle here is clear." "I'm not finished, Professor," Crockett interjected, her voice rising just enough to command the space. "You've had your uninterrupted time to speak. I'd appreciate the same courtesy." The other panelists exchanged glances. This wasn't the typical polite disagreement that characterized most cable news debates. There was something raw and authentic unfolding. A genuine confrontation between two legal minds with vastly different perspectives and experiences. Crockett turned slightly to address the camera directly. "The professor suggests I'm conflating legal principles, but what he's doing is more concerning. He's selectively citing precedent while ignoring key Supreme Court decisions that directly contradict his position." She reached for a leather portfolio that had been sitting on the table beside her. Pulling out several sheets of paper, "I anticipated this discussion, so I came prepared with citations. In United States v. Nixon, a unanimous Supreme Court, including justices appointed by Republican presidents, rejected exactly the kind of expansive executive privilege interpretation the professor is advocating." Dershowitz leaned forward, his face flushing slightly. "Congressman, you're mischaracterizing my position and the Nixon case. I was actually involved in those discussions at the time. What the court held was—" "I have the majority opinion right here, Professor," Crockett interrupted, holding up one of her papers. "Would you like me to read Justice Berger's exact words? Because they directly contradict what you just claimed." The camera caught Cooper glancing at his producer off-screen, clearly sensing this segment was veering into territory more heated than anticipated. Dershowitz's voice took on an edge. "This is precisely the problem with political discourse today. Elected officials cherry-pick legal opinions without understanding their context or limitations." Crockett smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Cherry-picking? That's an interesting accusation from someone who just minutes ago cited Marbury v. Madison, but conveniently omitted McCulloch v. Maryland, which established federal supremacy in a way that undermines your entire argument." The political correspondent attempted to jump in. "If I could just add some context to—" "Excuse me," Dershowitz cut in, his voice rising. "I've taught these cases for over 50 years. The Congresswoman is presenting a simplified version that any serious legal scholar would reject." Crockett didn't flinch. "Is Chief Justice John Roberts a serious enough legal scholar for you, Professor? Because in Trump v. Mazars, he wrote, and I quote, 'The president is not above the law.' That opinion, which came out just a few years ago, established clear limitations on executive privilege of exactly the kind you're claiming don't exist." The tension in the studio was mounting. Dershowitz's usual eloquence seemed to be faltering as Crockett continued to cite specific cases and opinions that contradicted his sweeping claims. Each time he attempted to dismiss her points, she responded with another precisely aimed legal reference. "Professor," she continued, "you mentioned earlier that you've held consistent positions across administrations. But that's demonstrably false." She pulled out another document from her portfolio. In 1998, during the Clinton impeachment, you argued that impeachment did not require a statutory crime. Yet in 2019, you completely reversed yourself when defending President Trump, arguing that impeachment required a statutory crime. Dershowitz's face tightened. That's a gross mischaracterization of my position. What I said was, I have the transcripts of your own words on both occasions, Professor, Crockett interrupted, sliding the papers across the table toward him. Would you like to explain to viewers how these diametrically opposed positions represent consistency? The former Justice Department official whistled low under his breath, clearly impressed by Crockett's preparation and precision. Dershowitz's voice rose as he responded. This is exactly why legal matters shouldn't be reduced to sound bites on cable news. Complex constitutional issues require nuanced understanding That's precisely my point, Professor, Crockett cut in. These are complex issues that deserve serious, consistent legal analysis, not shifting interpretations based on which political party might benefit. The camera caught Dershowitz's hand, trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. For perhaps the first time in his decades-long media career, the renowned lawyer appeared genuinely rattled. Let me be clear, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. I didn't come to Congress from an ivory tower. I came from courtrooms where real people's lives and liberties were at stake. I've seen firsthand how constitutional protections matter most to those with the least power. Cooper, sensing the need to widen the discussion, turned to the other panelists. Let's get some other perspectives on this. One moment, Anderson, Crockett said firmly. The professor questioned my legal understanding and suggested I need remedial education. I think it's important that I address that directly. She turned back to Dershowitz, who was now sitting rigid in his chair, his earlier smugness completely evaporated. Professor, you've spent decades at Harvard teaching law. I respect that. But I've spent years in courtrooms fighting for clients who couldn't afford high-price attorneys, whose understanding of justice came not from textbooks, but from their lived experience with a system that often failed them. The studio had fallen completely silent, even the production crew behind the cameras transfixed by the unfolding confrontation. So when you sit here and condescend to me about constitutional principles, Crockett continued, her voice steady but intense, you're not just dismissing me, you're dismissing the experiences of countless Americans who have had to fight for the constitutional protections that you discuss in the abstract. Dershowitz attempted to regain his footing. Congresswoman, this emotional appeal doesn't address the legal substance. There is nothing emotional about citing specific Supreme Court precedents that contradict your position, Professor, Crockett responded immediately. There's nothing emotional about pointing out your own contradictory statements over the years. This isn't emotion, it's evidence. As the segment approached its midpoint, it was becoming increasingly clear to viewers that this was no ordinary political exchange. Jasmine Crockett had come armed not just with passion, but with meticulous preparation, challenging one of America's most famous legal minds on his own territory. And so far, she was winning. The struggle was real and raw, with Dershowitz increasingly on the defensive, unable to dismiss Crockett's points with his usual rhetorical flourishes. As Cooper finally managed to cut to a commercial break, the tension in the studio remained electric, with millions of viewers anxiously waiting to see what would happen when they returned. When the cameras started rolling again after the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio had changed dramatically. Alan Dershowitz, who had entered the segment with casual confidence, now sat stiffly in his chair, papers spread before him, clearly having used the break to prepare a counteroffensive. Across from him, Congresswoman Crockett remained composed, her portfolio open but her focus entirely on the conversation at hand. Anderson Cooper, sensing the heightened stakes, tried to reset the discussion. Before the break, we were discussing interpretations of executive privilege. Professor Dershowitz, did you want to clarify your position? Dershowitz leaned forward, his voice taking on a professorial tone once more. Yes, Anderson. I think there's been some confusion about what I've actually argued over the years. If the Congresswoman had read my full writings, rather than selected quotes, she would understand that my positions have been entirely consistent. Within their proper context, he shuffled through his notes, pulling out a printed page. For example, in my 2018 book, The Case Against Impeaching Trump, I clearly outlined the constitutional standard as, "I have read your book, Professor," Crockett interjected calmly. "In fact, I have it right here." She pulled the actual hardcover from her bag and placed it on the table. Page 143, you write, and I quote, "An impeachable offense requires criminal-like behavior. Yet, in your 1998 appearance on Larry King Live discussing the Clinton impeachment, you stated, 'You don't need a technical crime. These positions are not reconcilable, regardless of context.'" The former Justice Department official nodded, adding, "I remember those arguments well." Dershowitz's face flushed. "Those statements are being taken out of context. What I meant was..." "Professor," Crockett said, her voice quiet but firm, "this is the moment that's going to change everything in this conversation, because I didn't just bring quotes." She reached into her portfolio again and pulled out a USB drive, which she slid across to a production assistant standing just off camera. "I've brought video." Cooper looked surprised. "What video are you referring to, Congresswoman?" "With the production team's permission, I'd like viewers to see exactly what Professor Dershowitz said, in his own words, during the Clinton impeachment and then during the Trump impeachment. No quotes that can be disputed, just his own unedited statements." The production assistant hurriedly connected the USB to a computer, and within moments, the studio screens displayed a split-screen video. On the left, a younger Dershowitz, on CNN in 1998, emphatically stating, "Impeachment doesn't require a crime. The Constitution talks about high crimes and misdemeanors, but that doesn't mean they have to be behavior that abuses power. It means they have to be behavior that abuses power." On the right side of the split screen, Dershowitz in 2019 on Fox News, "Without a crime, there can be no impeachment. The Constitution is clear, it must be treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." The studio fell completely silent as the clips played. When the screens returned to the live feed, all eyes turned to Dershowitz, whose face had gone from flushed to ashen. That's not, he stammered, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Crockett didn't press her advantage immediately. Instead, she spoke softly, almost sympathetically. "Professor, we all evolve in our thinking. There's no shame in changing positions based on new information or insights. What concerns me is the denial that the change happened at all, and that these changes seem to align perfectly with partisan interests, rather than consistent legal principles." The political correspondent let out a low whistle. That's about as clear a contradiction as I've ever seen. Dershowitz attempted to recover. "Those clips don't show the full context of my arguments. Legal positions are nuanced and complex." "Yes, they are," Crockett agreed. "Which is exactly why your dismissal of my legal understanding earlier was so troubling. These issues deserve serious engagement, not condescension or partisan flexibility." She turned to address the camera directly. "The American people deserve honest legal analysis, especially from those with platforms as significant as Professor Dershowitz's. When legal experts change their interpretations of the Constitution based on which party holds power, it erodes public trust in our entire system." Cooper, recognizing the decisive shift in the conversation, asked, "Professor Dershowitz, how do you respond to the video evidence that appears to show you taking directly contradictory positions?" Well, Dershowitz's legendary composure had completely evaporated. That's not a fair characterization. If you look at the totality of my work..." His voice trailed off as he shuffled through his papers, searching for something that could help him regain his footing. Crockett continued, her voice steady and clear. "Professor, earlier you suggested I need remedial constitutional education. I don't believe that's true, but I do believe all of us, especially those with significant public platforms, have a responsibility to approach these issues with intellectual honesty." She turned to the rest of the panel. "This isn't just about the professor or me. It's about how we discuss constitutional principles in public. When legal experts treat our founding document like a malleable tool to achieve political ends, rather than the framework that protects all Americans' rights, we all lose." The former Justice Department official nodded. Congresswoman Crockett is raising an important point about consistency in legal interpretation. Dershowitz, his voice noticeably weaker than at the beginning of the segment, attempted one final defense. My decades of teaching and writing on constitutional law can't be reduced to 2 video clips. This is precisely the kind of gotcha journalism that— Professor, Crockett interrupted gently, those aren't gotcha questions. Those are your own words, spoken clearly and deliberately on national television. If they contradict each other, that's not the fault of journalism, that's a contradiction you created. The camera caught a bead of sweat forming on Dershowitz's brow as he reached again for his water glass. The hand holding it trembled slightly as he took a sip. Cooper, sensing that the moment had decisively shifted, turned to Crockett. Congresswoman, beyond pointing out these contradictions, what's your broader concern here? Crockett sat up straighter, her eyes clear and focused. My concern is for the American people who watch legal experts on television and trust that they're getting consistent, principled analysis. When constitutional interpretation changes based on political convenience, it damages that trust. She glanced at Dershowitz, who was staring down at his scattered notes. The professor has had an illustrious career. He's taught generations of lawyers. That's precisely why it matters when someone of his stature appears to adjust his constitutional interpretations based on which party might benefit. The political correspondent nodded in agreement. We're seeing a clear pattern here that's difficult to dismiss. As the segment approached its conclusion, the transformation was complete. Dershowitz, who had begun by mockingly offering Crockett remedial education, now sat silent and diminished, unable to effectively counter the evidence she had methodically presented. Crockett, initially dismissed as legally unsophisticated, had emerged as the voice of principled consistency. Cooper turned to Dershowitz for a final response. Professor, would you like to address the congressman's points? Dershowitz's response, when it finally came, was perhaps the most shocking moment of the entire exchange. Perhaps I overstated my critique of the Congresswoman's legal understanding. These are complex issues on which reasonable people can disagree. It was as close to a concession as the famous attorney had ever made on national television. The studio remained silent for a moment, everyone present aware they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A turning point not just in this discussion, but potentially in how these constitutional debates would be conducted in the future. As the CNN segment approached its final minutes, the transformation in the studio was palpable. Alan Dershowitz, who had begun the discussion with confident dismissals of Congresswoman Crockett's legal understanding, now sat back in his chair, his notes disorganized before him, his usual assertiveness notably absent. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, appeared energized yet measured, her points having landed with undeniable impact. Anderson Cooper, recognizing the significance of what had transpired, sought to draw out the broader implications. Congressman Crockett, beyond this specific disagreement with Professor Dershowitz, what do you think this exchange reveals about our national discourse on constitutional matters? Crockett thoughtfully gathered her papers, taking a moment before responding. What we've seen today reflects a larger problem in our political conversation, Anderson. Too often, expertise is wielded as a shield against accountability, rather than as a tool for genuine understanding. She glanced briefly at Dershowitz before continuing. The Constitution isn't the exclusive property of Ivy League professors or Washington insiders. It belongs to all Americans, the factory worker in Detroit, the teacher in Tulsa, the nurse in my district in Dallas. When we treat constitutional interpretation as something that can shift with political winds, we betray that collective ownership. The former Justice Department official nodded in agreement. There's a reason Supreme Court justices write dissents, even when they lose a case. They're creating a record of consistent legal reasoning that transcends individual outcomes. Dershowitz, seemingly finding some of his voice again, attempted a final defense. My positions have always been based on careful legal analysis, not political expediency. The clips shown earlier failed to capture the nuance of my arguments. Crockett responded with unexpected gentleness. Professor, I don't doubt your legal knowledge or your contributions to constitutional scholarship. What I question is the consistency with which those principles are applied. Because inconsistency in legal interpretation doesn't just affect academic debates, it affects real people whose rights and liberties depend on fair application of constitutional principles. The political correspondent interjected, "What we've witnessed today is extraordinary in modern political discourse, a substantive debate about constitutional principles backed by specific evidence rather than talking points." Cooper turned to address the viewers directly. As we wrap up this segment, it's worth noting how rarely we see this level of specific engagement on constitutional issues, despite their fundamental importance to our democracy. Dershowitz, making a final effort to salvage his position, straightened in his chair. "While I disagree with the Congresswoman's characterization of my work, I appreciate her passionate defense of constitutional consistency. Perhaps this conversation can lead to more substantive debates about these critical issues." It was a gracious pivot, but viewers could see it for what it was, a tactical retreat from a battle he had unexpectedly lost. Crockett accepted the olive branch with grace. "I would welcome that, Professor, because these aren't abstract debates. They determine how power is exercised and constrained in our democracy." As the segment concluded, Cooper thanked both guests for what he described as one of the most substantive exchanges we've hosted on these issues. The cameras captured a final wide shot of the panel, Dershowitz gathering his scattered papers, his expression subdued, Crockett calmly organizing her portfolio, her evidence having spoken for itself. But the impact of the exchange was just beginning. Within minutes of the segment ending, clips began circulating on social media platforms. The hashtag Crockett Clapback started trending on X, accompanied by the video of Dershowitz's contradictory impeachment statements and his visible discomfort when confronted with them. Political commentators across the spectrum weighed in. Conservative legal analyst Jonathan Turley tweeted, "Regardless of your political position, Congresswoman Crockett's preparation and specific citations represent how constitutional debates should be conducted." Liberal MSNBC host Rachel Maddow opened her show that evening with, "What we witnessed today wasn't just a congressional representative holding her own against a famous legal scholar. It was a masterclass in how to confront selective constitutional interpretation with receipt." Fox News, initially hesitant to cover the exchange, eventually ran a segment framing it as a heated debate between legal minds, though they notably showed far less of the damaging video evidence than other networks. Law schools across the country incorporated clips from the exchange into their constitutional law classes, with professors using it to illustrate the importance of consistent legal reasoning regardless of political outcomes. For Dershowitz, the aftermath was challenging. Invitations to television appearances temporarily declined, and his next book tour was met with questions about the CNN exchange at every stop. Several of his former Harvard colleagues privately expressed concern about the damage to his scholarly reputation. For Crockett, the impact was transformative. House Democratic leadership, recognizing her effectiveness, began featuring her more prominently in constitutional discussions. Law schools invited her to speak about her experiences bridging legal practice and legislative work. Young lawyers, particularly women of color, cited her as an inspiration for entering public service. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange altered how cable news programs approached constitutional debates. Producers began requiring guests making legal claims to provide specific citations rather than general assertions. Hosts became more willing to challenge inconsistencies in legal positions across administrations. 6 weeks after the CNN segment, Crockett and Dershowitz unexpectedly found themselves on the same panel at a constitutional law symposium at Georgetown University. The audience fell silent as they took their seats, the tension from their previous encounter hanging in the air. Dershowitz, speaking first, surprised the audience by addressing their CNN exchange directly. "Congresswoman Crockett and I had what might charitably be called a spirited disagreement on CNN some weeks ago," he began, drawing nervous laughter from the crowd. "While I maintain that my positions have been consistent within their proper contexts, I must acknowledge that the Congresswoman's preparation and specific citations represented exactly the kind of substantive engagement our constitutional discussions require." Crockett nodded in acknowledgement, and when her turn came to speak, she similarly extended an olive branch. Professor Dershowitz and I will likely continue to disagree on many constitutional interpretations, but what matters most isn't who wins these debates. It's whether the American people benefit from hearing genuine engagement with the principles that govern our democracy. The symposium moderator later described it as a model for how scholarly disagreements should proceed, with respect for evidence and a commitment to consistent principles rather than predetermined outcomes. Back in Crockett's Texas district, the impact was perhaps most meaningful. At a town hall meeting, a young black woman studying law approached her with tears in her eyes. "I watched you stand your ground with Professor Dershowitz," she said. "You showed me that my voice and my understanding of the law matter, even when people with more famous names try to dismiss them." Crockett embraced her, later telling her staff that this interaction meant more to her than all the national media attention combined. The CNN exchange had another unexpected consequence. Following Crockett's methodical dismantling of selective constitutional interpretation, several other representatives began adopting similar approaches. Congressional hearings featuring legal experts became more substantive, with representatives from both parties pressing witnesses on the consistency of their interpretations across administrations. A senior Democratic strategist commented to Politico, Crockett didn't just win an argument, she changed how these conversations happen. She showed that preparation and specificity beat reputation and generalizations every time. Even Dershowitz, in a reflective op-ed published several months later, acknowledged the shift. While I maintain that my own positions have been mischaracterized, I must concede that our constitutional discourse benefits when all participants come armed with specific citations rather than general assertions. My exchange with Congresswoman Crockett, whatever its discomforts for me personally, has elevated how we debate these essential principles. For viewers who had witnessed the exchange, the lesson was clear. In a political landscape often dominated by talking points and partisan positioning, authentic knowledge and consistent principles still had the power to break through. Crockett's clapback wasn't just a viral moment. It was a template for how to reclaim substantive debate in an era of soundbites and selective outrage. As Cooper had noted in his closing remarks that day, what makes our constitutional system work isn't just the words on parchment, but the commitment of each generation to apply those principles consistently, regardless of which party might temporarily benefit. Crockett had demonstrated that commitment with undeniable effectiveness, and in doing so, she hadn't just won an argument, she had raised the standard for all such arguments to follow. The story of Jasmine Crockett's takedown of Alan Dershowitz became more than just another viral political moment. It became a case study in how preparation, specificity, and principled consistency could triumph over reputation and rhetorical flourishes. In courtrooms, classrooms, and congressional chambers across America, the exchange served as both warning and inspiration, a reminder that in constitutional matters, the most powerful argument isn't the loudest or most famous voice, but the one most firmly anchored in consistent principles. As one viral tweet summarized it, Dershowitz came with his reputation. Crockett came with receipts. Receipts won. Thanks for watching this incredible showdown between Congresswoman Crockett and Prof. and Professor Dershowitz. If you enjoyed this breakdown of how preparation and principles can triumph over reputation, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most powerful political confrontations that change the conversation in Washington and beyond. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video where we'll analyze who might be Jasmine Crockett's next target as she continues to make waves in Congress.